So traditional humanitarian action is based on a reactive approach, which basically means that we wait until an event has happened, a natural disaster, an earthquake, a flood, a cyclone, a conflict, to be able to mobilize the resources and the people to be able to act on behalf of communities. What happens with this is that responses are often late, they're often inadequate, and they're often not attuned to what communities want and need in that moment. Acting in a proactive way means changing our approach entirely. It means acting ahead of a crisis even before it occurs. And this can happen in two ways. One, we can anticipate the needs in an emergency in the very, very early stages of an emergency happening. A sudden population movement, a flood, where we weren't able to predict it with enough time, but what we can do is minimize the suffering as soon as it starts happening by acting early, getting the funds on the ground as quickly as possible, and shoring up communities' ability to cope. The second way we can act proactively is by modeling the risks ahead of time. And our analysis suggests that about half of emergencies are predictable, and about a quarter of them can actually be modeled ahead of time, that we have the knowledge, we have the science, we have the data and the tools to be able to understand what those risks are, put money behind those risks, so that when we can predict a risk happening, whether it's a heat wave or a flood or a windstorm, we can then start acting even before the event occurs to evacuate people, to feed their livestock, to make sure that everybody has access to food and access to markets before a drought occurs, for example. And in that way, we get ahead of human suffering before it happens. We get ahead of a crisis that we know will happen, and it becomes less expensive, more effective, and more appropriate for protecting communities. So what does this look like in practice? The past year, we've been running our Start Ready platform, and a few of our emergencies have triggered as a result. In Pakistan, for example, during excessive heat a few months ago, we were able to sit down with one of our local organizations to really establish what the risk of that heat was for that community. They helped us actually trigger the risk model because they could see that the heat levels were rising. They could see what the ground looked like, what the sky looked like, what the weather patterns were, and they knew best what those weather patterns would lead to. They then helped us put together a plan for what communities would need in the event of an extreme heat wave. And so when the funding did trigger, they were able to set up community cooling stations. We also did this in Zimbabwe this year. On the prediction of a drought, we got together with communities in different districts in Zimbabwe to model out what would happen if this drought were to hit. They told us about the things they would need. They would need food for livestock. They would need food for pregnant mothers. They would need cash assistance to be able to buy goods in the market before the drought happened so that they could eat during the lean times when their crops were failing. And so when we did release the funding, we got together with local organizations and international organizations to actually hand out cash assistance over the summer and through September and October to be able to get through those lean months. That has just finished, and we're now doing the analysis to find out what impact that had. And this isn't big money. This all might seem like a drop in the bucket and very small scale initiatives, but what it does point to is a mindset shift. It points to a proof of concept that anticipatory action does lead to less suffering, does lead to more efficient working, and does lead to more appropriate responses in a crisis. And we hope that just by generating the evidence around this, by generating the behavioral change that puts communities in the center as part of solutions, that we will be able to catalyze new initiatives that can scale these across the world.